Medieval kings were no strangers to having bizarre and sometimes cursed desires. Whether it was for gold, power, or just plain weird things, these guys wanted it all. But what were some of the most cursed desires of all? Well, that's what we're exploring today. We want to feel like we are in control of our lives. When we see someone else with power, we often want it for ourselves. This desire for power is especially strong in medieval kings. The desire to eat a baby was actually quite common among medieval kings. This may seem like an odd desire for a king to have, but during the Middle Ages, having a son and heir was extremely important. This was because the king's power was hereditary, and it was essential that he have a male heir to take over for him when he died. If the king did not have a son, his kingdom could potentially be taken over by a rival. As a result, it was not uncommon for medieval kings to have harems of women in order to ensure that they would have a son. These women would often be kept in a separate part of the palace, and the king would visit them on a regular basis. Some kings even had their wives selected for their fertility. They would often have multiple wives in order to increase their chances of producing a male heir. In addition to having a physical desire for a child, medieval kings were also driven by a deep psychological need to produce an heir. This was because the king was seen as the father of his kingdom, and so it was essential that he leave behind a son who could carry on his legacy. If the king failed to produce a male heir, he was seen as having failed in his duty, and this could lead to all sorts of problems, such as rebellion and civil war. As a result, medieval kings were often consumed by their desire to have a child. They would do whatever it took to ensure that they had a son, and they would often spend vast sums of money on harems of women in order to accomplish this goal. There are numerous accounts of kings being served up dishes that included small children. In fact, there are even recipes from the period that include instructions for cooking and serving up baby. So why did medieval kings want to eat babies? Well, there are a few theories. First, during the Middle Ages, it was common for families to have their children cooked and eaten as a way of preserving them. This was especially common among the nobility, who could afford to have their children prepared in this way. As a result, it is not surprising that many medieval kings developed a taste for baby meat. Second, eating a baby was seen as a way of gaining power and strength. This was because the child was seen as being the most pure form of human flesh, and so consuming it was thought to imbue the eater with the childlike qualities of innocence and purity. Finally, it should be noted that eating a baby was not always done out of choice. Sometimes children were simply the victims of circumstance. For example, during times of famine, desperate parents would sometimes sell their children to be cooked and eaten. After all, they were the most powerful people in their respective countries, but they still wanted more power. One of the most famous examples of a medieval king's desire for ultimate power is King Louis XIV of France. He was known as the Sun King, and he ruled over France for over 72 years. He was incredibly powerful, but he still wanted more. He embarked on a series of wars in an attempt to expand his empire. Unfortunately for Louis, he was never successful in his quest for ultimate power. But he wasn't the only medieval king to try. In fact, there are countless stories of medieval kings who waged wars and conquered lands in an attempt to gain more power. Again, this makes sense. Kings were the most powerful people in their countries, but they still wanted more. Power is addictive, and these kings were simply giving in to their addictions. But ultimately, none of them were successful in their quest for ultimate power. Perhaps this is because they were already kings. Maybe true power doesn't come from being a king, but from being a good leader. From a king who wanted to live forever to one who wanted to eat a baby, gold is one of the most precious metals on earth. It is rare and valuable, and it has been coveted by humans for centuries. For medieval kings, gold was the ultimate symbol of wealth and power, and so it is no surprise that so many of them had an insatiable desire for gold. One of the most famous examples of a medieval king's desire for gold is King Solomon of Israel. He was known for his wisdom, but he was also known for his love of gold. In fact, he is said to have owned more gold than any other king before or since. Solomon used his vast wealth to build magnificent palaces and temples, but he also used it to buy weapons and armies. He wanted to be the most powerful king in the world, and he knew that gold would help him achieve this goal. Of course, Solomon was not the only medieval king to be obsessed with gold. In fact, there are countless stories of medieval kings who amassed vast fortunes. But this desire for gold often came at a cost. Many medieval kings went to war to try and acquire more gold, and many people died as a result. Additionally, the obsession with gold often led to the corruption of medieval kings. When you have so much gold, it is easy to become greedy and corrupt. Many medieval kings did just that. The desire for gold was one of the most powerful forces in the medieval world, and it is no surprise that so many kings were consumed by it. These are 5 of the most cursed desires of any medieval king. Starting off this countdown at No. 5, we have the desire for immortality. There has always been a desire by many people throughout history to find the secret to living forever. Many believe they have found the answer in things like cryogenics, but there is still a long way to go before we can truly live forever. Immortality is something that is impossible to achieve. It is simply not possible for a human being to live forever. Our bodies are simply not built for it. We age, we get sick, and we die. That is just how it is. But despite this, there are still many people who search for the secret to immortality. They want to live forever. And medieval kings were no different. In fact, some would argue that medieval kings were even more obsessed with immortality than people today. After all, they had access to some of the most powerful magic users in the world. And they believed that these magic users could help them cheat death. One of the most famous examples of a medieval king's desire for immortality was King Edward VII of England. He was obsessed with alchemy and spent much of his time searching for the Philosopher's Stone, which was said to be able to turn lead into gold. He believed that if he could find the Philosopher's Stone, it would give him the secret to immortality. Of course, he never found it. But he wasn't the only medieval king to search for the secret to immortality. In fact, there are countless stories of medieval kings who spent their entire reign searching for ways to cheat death. Unfortunately, none of them ever succeeded. The desire for immortality is a powerful one, and it is clear that medieval kings were just as susceptible to it as anyone else. But up next at No. For we have the desire for ultimate power. Power is something that all humans crave. Moving on at No. 3, we have the desire for gold. But up next at No. 2, we have the desire to eat a baby. While it may seem shocking in today's world, and in our number 1 spot today, we have the desire for a child. Thanks for watching. See you next time.